Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 25 minutes before 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. I think our next guest must be our age, or the same generation we're from, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Do you remember like in the 60s when people were protesting things and they'd have kind of like the Occupy movement that we've seen like in recent years. I don't know if they called it that though, right? Mm-hmm. Our next guest was part of that. He was trying to make some changes up at Cornell in Ithaca. I'm thinking... I'm right there. I'm not really sure about that. But he's trying to make some changes. I think he wanted to add some African American curriculum to the school to what they were teaching, right? If I remember right.
Yes.
And then he went on to working for Wall Street, and so it almost seems like the kids today are protesting Wall Street, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
In a way, I understand better what we were protesting back then than I do sometimes what is being protested now, but sometimes it takes... Maybe I'm getting old. Is that what it is, Robin? Mm-hmm. Thomas W. Jones, I don't mean to put you in our same age category. I have no idea. His book is called From Willard Straight to Wall Street. That would be Willard Straight Hall up in Ithaca, in Cornell. Good morning, Thomas. How are you? Good morning.
Good morning, Larry. Thanks for inviting me to be on your show.
Oh, you're welcome. Where are you calling from?
I'm up in Stamford, Connecticut.
Oh, you're in Connecticut. All right. Have you lived there long?
30 years. I actually live in New Canaan, which is right next to Stamford, but my office is in Stamford, and I've been here since 1989.
So before we get to the crux of the book, and thank you so much for being on the show, when you look at the protests of today, do you get it? I mean, is it the same spirit as the protests that you're going to tell us about in a moment?
Well, I get it, but with one difference. I wrote my memoir, my book, in part to be a message of hope for America, because I'm concerned with our country's current drift into angry racial, cultural, and political divisions. Our public discourse seems to focus incessantly on the negatives, the things that divide us, and we rarely celebrate the success and progress our country has achieved with regards to racial issues and other cultural issues. And I believe that celebrating our success, along with acknowledging the shortcomings that still exist, is necessary for our collective social psyche. We can't always be mired in the negative. And this country has come a long way. In fact, if you had described America today to people back in the 1960s, most observers would have said that is not possible. This country could not change to that degree. But it has happened, and it's something that we should be proud of.
Absolutely.
And I want that message to be heard in the country.
Absolutely. Boy, you couldn't have said it any better. There was a story yesterday about Rosa Parks. There was a statue being erected for Rosa Parks. And just like you said, that you wouldn't have even imagined that happening back in the 60s. I'm going to guess you're a tiny bit older than us, because I was old enough to know what was going on, but not old enough to get permission to go protest down in the. So that kind of helps you. But
you're right.
But I think
I'm 70. So
the things you were protesting, though, really did change the world. And when and you want to know something. I live in the South now. I live in Florida, and I see interracial, biracial couples all the time. We work at the mall. The radio station is at a mall, so I see it all the time. And yet the talk show hosts make it seem like we're still fighting each other. I don't get it. I think sometimes the media does a disservice. Is what I think.
Well, I'm old enough that when I was a kid, even though we lived in New York, my parents' families were from Virginia and North Carolina. And so in the late 1950s, traveling with my parents to visit their families, my dad would always ask when we stopped for gas, were we allowed to use the restrooms?
Oh my gosh.
So, my family experienced those Jim Crow laws, which still existed in the country right up until the 1960s. And so our country has come a long way, not just in that dimension, but in talk about the African Americans have achieved success at the highest levels of every profession and occupation in the country: medicine, law, business, the arts, entertainment, sports. We've had an African American elected president of the country. Millions of African Americans have lifted themselves out of poverty because of what is now access to reasonably decent education and fair employment opportunities. So a lot has been accomplished, even though I acknowledge, for example, when Black Lives Matters protest violence against unarmed black men, I get it, and they're right. But I also recognize the truth is that for every such incident that occurs like that today, the relative frequency was 50 times greater 50 years ago, and proportionately 100 times greater 100 years ago. And so I don't know that we'll ever eliminate all of the wrongdoing. I mean, it's a society of humans after all, and some people are good and some people are not so good. So I try to maintain a proportional perspective. I don't hide from the negatives that still exist, but I say, gee, the positives far outweigh the negatives, and we should acknowledge that and be proud of what our country has done.
Absolutely. Boy, I love how you speak. I love your choice of words. When the Occupy Wall Street movement was going on just a few years ago, Robin and I made a call, and we asked some of them up there if somebody could get on the phone and explain what they were protesting. And it wasn't that we were against them doing whatever they were doing. It's that we didn't understand what they were doing. And they needed somebody who could articulate the way you can, because we didn't get anybody on the phone who could actually tell us what they were even protesting. That made sense anyway. Yeah, so I mean, I just think that's what's lacking, and maybe there's something about being young that makes you just naturally want to protest things. Maybe that's just part of growing up. But in your case, in our whole generation's case, there was a lot that needed to be fixed.
Well, to put it in perspective, I was 20 years old when the 19, just going on 20, when the occupation of Willard Strait at Cornell occurred, and I thought my generation had been fingered by history. Kind of the turning wheel of history, the random wheel of history had said that this generation is the generation of African Americans that is tasked with changing the oppression and suppression of African Americans in this country. And the truth is, the country had a very harsh history. In slavery, the basis of much of of America's economic prosperity and explosive economic growth for 200 years, from the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s, was the cash crops: tobacco, sugarcane, and cotton, which drove the economy of the country, both the plantations in the South, which actually grew the crops, but also the industries in the North, which provided all of the tools and equipment, and the shipping industry, which transported the goods and transported the slaves. That was very harsh. It was actually illegal for African Americans to be taught to read and write. And then after the Civil War, even though there was the Emancipation Proclamation, the Ku Klux Klan emerged to terrorize and intimidate blacks in the South to keep them from voting. And then with the control of the ballot box, that led to the Jim Crow laws and all of those things which suppressed the black community. And even in the 1930s, with people as good as Franklin Delano Roosevelt in power, trying to bring the country out of the Great Depression, the programs that brought prosperity to America, things like Social Security and the housing programs were written in ways that excluded most Black Americans from participating. So, for example, Social Security, when it was written in the 1930s, excluded the occupations of household domestic and agricultural worker. And those were the occupations that employed most African Americans in those days.
Oh, my God.
And the federal housing insurance mortgage programs were written in ways that most Black communities were redlined and excluded from being able to get those low-cost mortgages with federal mortgage insurance.
Right.
So I understood this history,
right,
and I just felt my generation is the generation that is going to fight about this and say no more. But, Larry, I also understand, I think the country faced a metaphorical fork in the road in the 1960s. The right fork was going to be racial oppression and suppression. The left fork was going to try to raise our practices to the level of our aspirational ideals. And I believe that the country took the left fork towards racial inclusion and equality, and we ought to just acknowledge that and celebrate it, even as we know we don't have a perfect society by far, but it is so much better than it was 50 years ago, and the country should be proud of how much we've accomplished.
Absolutely. I often think it is the young people that are just coming of age, the college-age kids, that are the ones who see the problems that are currently in existence, and the ones who speak up about it, the ones who write songs about it, and books and poetry, and the ones who make a noise. I mean, you were part of that group at that time, and I guess I just think it's a good thing when I hear that we have somebody protesting. I don't always know that they understand what they're protesting, but I see it as a good thing. Do you still carry that torch? Do you, like, for example, I was reading some of your bio that some of the corrupt things that we saw on Wall Street just in the last few decades, when you were no longer, I guess you were already working for Wall Street at that time. Is it the same thing? Do we see, because corruption is always, I mean, corruption is as corruption is, right?
Well, one of the things that saddens me is what I would call the economic division in the country. Let me give you an example. When I started my career in the early 1970s, a top CEO, Reginald Jones, retiring as the CEO of General Electric, and GE was probably the most admired company in the country at that time in the early 1970s. He retired with a $10 million payout, and everybody was talking about how rich he was. And $10 million was a lot of money, and in today's dollars, that's equivalent to about $50 million. Okay, but when CEOs retire today from the Fortune 500 companies, often they're walking away with $1 billion. And they didn't create new industries like a Steve Gates did, like a Steve Jobs did, or
Bill Gates.
With the iPhone, they didn't create new industries like microcomputing or biotechnology.
Right.
I mean, people that have just been good stewards and run their companies well, but didn't create those companies or create those industries.
Right.
Guys are walking away with $1 billion, and then the number 2 has got $500 million, and the number 3 has got $250, the number 4 has got $125, and that money comes from somewhere, and that money has come from stripping head count out of top corporations and stripping retirement benefits and stripping medical benefits And that's why there's some alienation in the country. That's why young people are saying, gee, maybe socialism is a better idea than capitalism. And so it saddens me, Larry, that kind of, I thought of us in the 60s as the selfless generation. I mean, most of us, when we were protesting about civil rights or protesting about the Vietnam War, it wasn't about getting ahead with career planning. It was about idealism and trying to build a better society. So, and American corporations in that era were relatively compassionate. When people worked for a top corporation like a GE, they thought they had lifetime employment. They thought that they knew that they had outstanding medical benefits. They had outstanding defined benefit retirement plans, which were intended to replace approximately 60 to 70% of their employment earnings, because that was calculated to be the after-tax equivalent of what was necessary to maintain your standard of living. And most corporations, top corporations, paid for employee education. I mean, I got my MBA degree on an employment assistance program at the Big 8 public accounting firm, paying for me to go to night school to get my MBA degree. And so there was a benevolent, compassionate form of capitalism, and a lot of that's been stripped away.
Right.
And it alienates the younger generation.
Oh,
and if you had told me that my generation would be the generation that was the cause of that, I would have said, no, that's not where the people in the 60s are going to take us.
Tom, there's a part of this I want to debate you on a little bit, and I think maybe you'll be able to, I think you'll get what I'm saying. I agree with everything you said. I think it's obscene that they get some of these retirement packages. It's outlandish that money is taken away from hardworking people so that one individual can go buy another planet if he wanted to. But there's part of me that thinks that government shouldn't be having anything to say about it. I just think government should stay out of it. Now, I want you to debate me and show me that I'm wrong about that, because I had actually never heard that the way they get that $1 billion retirement package is by taking away from the health benefits of the people who had devoted their lives to them. If that's true, then maybe the government involvement should be there to make a law to prevent that kind of thing. If you could just comment on what I just said.
Well, let me explain how that came about. In the 1980s, a relatively new industry got started. The corporate raiders, they were doing what were called leveraged buyout deals. It was the kind of corporate takeovers that were financed by Mike Milken in his heyday with junk bonds. And these guys, there were practitioners like Kohlberg, Kravitz, and Roberts was one of the KKR, one of the early practitioners. And what they understood was that you could take over a major corporation through this debt financing that they secured from Mike Milken. So the raider would take over the corporation. They would strip out the cost. And the way they stripped out the cost was, cutting headcount, cutting the medical benefits, cutting the retirement benefits. When you cut all that cost, the cash flow of the company would surge, and so the company could be valued more highly, and then they would sell it back into the public market. And so the corporate CEOs, the people like the heads of the GEs of the world, they're watching this, and these people, these raiders, are making like hundreds of millions of dollars by stripping out these costs from corporations and reselling them back into the market. And so corporate CEOs started saying, gee, if this is what capitalism is going to reward people for doing, I can do that too. And so the corporate mentality shifted from, let's take care of all of our constituencies, not just the shareholders, but also our employees and our communities and so on. It shifted to let's maximize cash flow, let's maximize earnings, let's maximize the stock price, because that's what the stock market was paying people for doing. So it's not a malicious kind of thing.
Right.
It was just, responding to what the economic incentives seem to be. And so corporate America has shifted since the 1980s to where the focus is on maximizing shareholder returns, which means, trying to maximize your cash flow and your earnings. And one of the key ways to do that is to hold down the cost within the corporation, which means holding down headcount, holding down compensation, holding down medical benefits, holding down retirement benefits. And so, my point of view is that we had a healthier society when the corporate ethos was more of a compassionate, we're here to service our shareholders, but we also care a lot about our employees and our communities.
And the whole selfish feeling that we get from people. Who's the guy that just died, the child molester? What's his name?
Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah. Think about what his life was like. Just completely ignoring people's needs, completely having no problem with using other human beings. And it's really, it's kind of the same thing as using other human beings for your own financial benefit as it is for your sexual gratification. It's the same thing. It's a selfish thing, and I think you are still on the steps of Willard Straight Hall. You are still there. You are the perfect person to be delivering this message to us all.
Well, I care about people, and I don't want to imply that these guys don't care about people. That's not fair, because many of these top people in corporate America are basically good people. They just need to see. They just need to be able to see, that it's a better country when the wealth and the benefits are spread a little more equally.
Okay.
And, Larry, one of the reasons corporate America became more compassionate is because in the 1930s, when the Great Depression occurred, there was great fear that Americans were going to turn towards socialism or communism. And that's one of the reasons corporate America became more compassionate, because it was trying to secure the loyalty of the American voters. And we're kind of coming up to a similar kind of situation. It's alarming when large numbers of the millennial generation are saying, gee, maybe I would be better off under socialism, rather than capitalism. That's a message that we need to heed. And, my feeling is that our political system will respond positively, that we are capable of making those adjustments and becoming a more compassionate society, just as we made the adjustments with regards to race relations and other issues like, the women's movement and so on and so forth.
Right. I have enjoyed this conversation more than I can tell you. I really am honored that you chose this radio station to talk about your book on. The book is called From Willard Straight to Wall Street. If you know the story about the occupation of Willard Straight Hall, did you carry a gun with you? What is that on the cover? No, that's a stick, right?
Oh, that's a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph. It was taken by Steve Starr, who worked for Newsweek at the time. He worked for the Associated Press, pardon me. That photograph, which is me exiting Willard Straight Hall, carrying a rifle. I have a knife in my belt, a war club dangling from my belt. That photograph, which won the Pulitzer Prize, was the cover of Newsweek magazine in April 1969. We didn't have guns when we took over the building, but a group of white fraternity guys, Delta Upsilon, broke into the student union building, and because they thought, we didn't have the right to be occupying this building, and they were going to throw us out of the building. And we fought with them. I wasn't even in the leadership of the black student group. I was down in the game room playing pool. I was part of the group that took over the building, but I wasn't in the leadership. And I'm down playing pool, and I hear this commotion, and I go out into the hallway, and these guys had broken into the building, and they're arguing with black students in the hallway. And it flashed through my mind, Larry, wow, this is like the vigilantes back in the 1870s. Yeah. Here we are, we've got a beef with the university administration, and now here come these vigilantes and decide that they're going to throw us out of the building. And it just flashed through my mind. This is like the Ku Klux Klan back in the 1870s deciding that they're going to intimidate the black population. And it just flashed through my mind. I went over to the first guy and I said, "We're not talking about this anymore." I punched him in the mouth. And we fought him and we threw him out of the building. But then there were so many rumors that there was going to be another assault against us, that we armed ourselves. And to put that in context, within the few years before we took over that building in 1969, there had been, in a 5-year span, President John Kennedy had been assassinated, Malcolm X had been assassinated, Martin Luther King had been assassinated, Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. There were riots in hundreds of cities across the country. Hundreds of people had been killed. Thousands were wounded. America was in a violent phase at that time. And, that's why we had guns, because, it seemed like the country was on the verge of tearing itself apart. So that's the context in which that occurred.
And in that same way, that punch in the face is now in the form of a book. That book is making a statement. I wish we had more time to talk about it, but I think you're making a great point. I found the book on Amazon. Do you have a website you'd like to direct us to?
Yes. My Facebook page is actually Willard Straight to Wall Street. You'll find it right there.
Okay, very good. Thomas Jones, stay safe, and thank you for your time and your work and your courage. And come back. And if you're ever in Central Florida, we'd love to have you in the studio.
Thank you, Larry. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Here is